Welcome back, folks. You ever wake up and wonder if we're all trapped in some kind of deranged political sitcom? Because every day it feels like the left is sprinting toward new levels of absurdity with a straight face. We've got an economy in shambles, crime running rampant, and global instability knocking on our door. But don't worry, the real crisis is making sure high school sports teams respect the ever-expanding buffet of pronouns. Yes, today's episode of Who Let These People Speak Again features a woke warrior in full meltdown mode, proving once again that modern progressivism isn't a political movement, it's a performance art piece. So buckle up, because if you thought the left had a grasp on reality, well, think again.
My pronouns are they, them, or at least that's what I share with people most often, but for this particular meeting, I will come out fully as saying that my pronouns are she, they, him.
Oh, shut up.
Now, I don't usually go into that because it becomes a quite interesting, delicate conversation about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman.
You don't know anything about being a man, dude.
And I get that. That is a conversation that we don't generally have as young people or even as adults in our current culture. Fair enough. So I will simply say what I told my 60-year-old father, who was also born and raised in the Madison area, like myself. I asked him, do you know what it means to be a man? And to his credit, he said, no, I don't. And then I asked him, do you know what it means to be a woman? And again, to his credit, he said, no, I don't.
This conversation never happened.
And then I looked at him and I said, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's where I land. I land at an understanding that my womanhood, as I was assigned at birth, does not come from my ability to produce children or to behave in a feminine way. And my manhood does not come in the form of my genitalia.
You do not have manhood, dude.
For that can be lost too.
You ain't got it. Anything to lose.
And so there is a discussion to be had about gender identity and understanding of what it means to be part of the LGBTQ community.
Let's dissect this latest woke meltdown, because if we don't, we'll be stuck in this alternate reality where common sense is a hate crime. Our speaker today, who seems to have taken gender pronouns for a joyride, decides to grace us with a she, they, him, a combination so nonsensical it sounds like a failed attempt at hijacking the English language. But beyond the surface level absurdity, this speech is a masterclass in rhetorical sleight of hand, logical fallacies, and the ever-growing trend of redefining reality to fit a personal fantasy. Now, let's talk about the self-contradiction baked into the core of this speech. It starts with, my pronouns are they, them. At least that's what I share with people most often. But for this particular meeting, I will come out fully. Ah, yes, because one set of made-up pronouns wasn't enough. We need to expand the collection for different occasions, like seasonal fashion trends. If identity is so innate and unchangeable, why is it something that can just be strategically altered depending on the audience? The speaker accidentally reveals what many of us already suspect. This is a performance, not principle. It's identity cosplay dressed up as activism. Now let's move to the philosophical detour where they attempt to make a profound statement about gender. They claim, we don't generally have conversations about what it means to be a man or a woman. That's objectively false. The concepts of masculinity and femininity have been debated, studied, and codified across every culture for quite literally millennia. The problem isn't that we don't have these conversations. It's that the radical gender ideologues don't like the answers. Then comes the anecdote about their father, which is so conveniently scripted, it might as well be the next Disney Plus original series. Allegedly, they asked their 60-year-old father whether he knows what it means to be a man, and he responded with a clue, oh, I don't know. Well, thank you for this completely unverifiable hearsay, because nothing says credibility like putting words in other people's mouths to support your ideology. Here's a fun exercise. Ask any man who actually built something, whether it's a business, a family, or even just a solid workout routine, what it means to be a man, and you'll get a much clearer answer. Responsibility, strength, discipline, sacrifice, and a pair of balls. Real men understand these things intuitively because they live them. But the most revealing part of this whole spectacle is the conclusion where they say, my womanhood, as I was assigned at birth, does not come from my ability to produce children or to behave in a feminine way, and my manhood does not come in the form of my genitalia. This is the ultimate word salad, mixing a complete misunderstanding of biology with a sprinkle of postmodern nonsense. First off, No one is assigned a gender at birth. Sex is observed, not arbitrarily assigned by a rogue doctor with a gender studies degree. And while it's true that identity isn't only about reproduction, pretending that biological realities are irrelevant is peak delusion. And let's not gloss over this little gem. My manhood does not come in the form of my genitalia, for that can be lost too. Oh. So now we're making the argument that if someone has an accident or undergoes surgery, it changes their fundamental identity. By that logic, if you lose an arm, you're no longer a human. If you get a bad haircut, your entire being is up for reconsideration. It's the classic woke move. Use an extreme hypothetical to justify throwing out thousands of years of biological reality. So what's the bigger picture here? It's not just about one confused activist on a microphone. It's about a larger cultural trend where personal feelings are supposed to override objective facts. And the real danger? The same people pushing this nonsense are the ones demanding access to shaping policies in school, sports, and even laws. They want to redefine reality, and anyone who dares to push back is labeled hateful for simply stating the obvious.
I'll pause to introduce myself a little bit more. I grew up as a 3-season student athlete. I started playing basketball and softball before I had working memory.
Nobody cares, dude.
In college, I played rugby, another fairly aggressive sport.
What do you want, a round of applause?
And I can only assume, because I know I cannot ask questions, but I can only assume you played basketball. And I echo the point of my fellow constituent just made a moment before, but I will go on to say, as a 5'8" student athlete,
Ooh, 5'8",
pretty much my size, and I'm not the smallest person, but I'm also not the biggest person.
You're small.
And if you need advice on how to play against people who are bigger than you,
no, we don't.
I could give you some advice.
Nobody wants
because
it.
I played post, and that means I was playing against the 5'10", 6'2" girls.
Against
in my
women.
division. You gotta get in their faces. You gotta get your hands up there. You gotta box them out so that when they go for the rebound, they go over your back. So this idea, and also to echo my constituents, people's bodies develop at a different rate, in different ways. I hear that, and I will be quick, not at all finishing everything I'd like to discuss. But regardless, I'll just say that this, frankly, thin veil, thin facade of protecting student athletes like me growing up is unacceptable. You playing sports, you can get hurt. And sure, we should concern ourselves about safety as much as possible, absolutely. But to say that trans female athletes are inherently more physically dangerous to biological female athletes is, quite frankly, absurd.
Why'd you put that in quotes, dude?
If you could wrap it up.
And with that, I'll just say, in addition to being a student athlete throughout my educational career, I am an educator. I am part of the LGBTQ community. And I did not hear about this meeting until I got finished teaching a full day of classes at around 4. I made my way here because some of the rhetoric I was hearing on the live stream was so appalling.
Wow, that was by far one of the most baffling displays of ideological gymnastics I have ever witnessed. Here we have a self-proclaimed athlete and educator and LGBTQIA plus NPCQ, whatever the hell else acronym add to that, activist, who believes that reality itself should bend to accommodate feelings. But don't worry, this isn't just about personal pronouns and identity politics. No, this is about sports, where biology suddenly doesn't matter, and fairness is just a thin facade. Now, let's break all this down step by step because it was an absolute train wreck. Now, the speech kicks off with an unnecessary life story. I grew up as a 3-season student athlete. I started playing basketball and softball before I had a working memory. Oh, well, congratulations. Nothing says scientific expertise like reminiscing about your childhood sports participation. But let's be clear. Nobody cares about personal anecdotes when discussing a systemic issue. The entire premise of this hearing is whether sports teams should be divided based on biological sex, not whether this person had a blast playing rugby in college. Then we get this gem. I can only assume you play basketball. Translation, I'm going to make a baseless assumption to sound relatable. And then, as if the speech wasn't already self-indulgent enough, we get a lecture on how to play against taller players. Vision. You gotta get in their faces. You gotta get your hands in there. You gotta box them out. Look, this isn't a pep talk for middle school tryouts, okay? It's a public hearing about policy. But here's a real kicker. This entire monologue is meant to suggest that biological differences in sports don't matter. And yet this person says, I was playing against 5'10", 6'2" girls, okay? And That's still within the range of natural female physiology. You weren't squaring up against a 6'4", 200-pound male who went through puberty as a man and then decided, actually, he's a woman now. That's how you get your nose broken, buddy. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the logical failures happening here. The speaker attempts to dismiss concerns about trans women, aka biological males, competing in women's sports by saying people's bodies develop at different rates in different ways. That is technically true, in the same way that saying some people are taller than others is also true. But it conveniently ignores the reality of biological advantages. Males, on average, have greater muscle mass, bone density, lung capacity, and faster twitch muscle fibers. These aren't feelings. They're facts, backed by decades of research in sports science. This is why Serena Williams herself admitted she wouldn't stand a chance against even the 700th ranked male tennis player in the world. That's the greatest female tennis player in the world saying that. It's why, despite decades of training and Olympic-level coaching, the best female runners in the world still can't match the times of high school boys. But here's where it gets really interesting. To say that trans female athletes are inherently more physically dangerous than biological female athletes is quite absurd, this person claims. Oh, it's absurd? Tell that to the biological women who have suffered concussions, broken bones, and career-ending injuries because they were forced to compete against biological males. Just ask the female volley player in North Carolina who suffered a serious head injury after being spiked in the face by a trans athlete, or the female MMA fighter who had her skull fractured by a trans competitor. These aren't hypotheticals. They're well-documented cases of biological reality playing out exactly as expected. Then we get the usual appeal to authority. I am an educator. I am part of the LGBTQIA NPC plus community. And neither of those things make you an expert in physiology, sports science, or policy for that matter. Being an educator doesn't mean you're right. It means you have a job in education, one that apparently doesn't require a strong grasp of biological fundamentals and reality. And being a part of the LGBTQ community is fine, but doesn't magically change bone structure, lung capacity, and fast twitch muscle fibers. Finally, the speech ends on a classic victimhood note. I did not hear about this meeting until I got finished into teaching a full day of classes. Right. Because we all know that every great argument hinges on when you found out about the hearing. What's the implication here? That the meeting was hidden from activists? That this person is so busy being a selfless warrior for justice in the classroom that they just had to rush in last minute to save the day? Give me a break. Here's the bottom line. This speech is a mix of emotional appeals, anecdotal distractions, and deliberate obfuscation of biological reality. It presents personal experiences as though they outweigh cold, hard science. And this is, by the way, the party of science. Funny how they pick and choose. This speech dismisses the actual risks of biological males in women's sports as absurd, while conveniently ignoring the real-world consequences. And of course, it wraps everything in a blanket of self-importance, because nothing screams valid argument like demanding special recognition just for showing up. So, to all the she-they hymns of the world, spare us the self-congratulatory monologues. Nobody cares. Reality doesn't care about your feelings, and neither does sports policy. Do you think this woke nightmare can get any worse? Well, I got a clip for you that's gonna just lower your expectations even more.
Good morning. Would you pray with me? Come, Holy Spirit, into the hearts of all of your beloved children, and kindle within us the fire of your unending and relentless love. May all of my words and our hearts together honor you today, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. But performing gender as a daily task, I would argue, is a learned cultural trait to which we have all been exposed. As understandings of drag have changed throughout history, perhaps drag today could be defined as that which threatens the already fragile and arbitrarily constructed framework for gender performance that is necessary to maintain power dynamics. Conversely, it could also be that from the moment we are born, and perhaps even before that, when families gather to reveal the sex organs of their child, that the drag show begins. The blue confetti falls and the pink smoke clears, and there's a mad dash to project cultural and societal expectations of gender performance onto that child. These are learned behaviors that can be shaped either through shame or affirmation based on a perceived correct performance of drag. And it has a profound effect on our imagination and our self-worth and our relationship to the world.
Good morning, indeed. And would you look at that? Another Sunday, another pulpit hijacked by the disciples of cultural Marxism, turning a house of worship into a progressive TED Talk. Today's sermon, courtesy of Reverend Brock Bottom, is what happens when leftist academia meets the Book of Common Prayer and tries to pass itself off as theology. So let's dig into this mess, shall we? Because nothing says Christian doctrine quite like reducing gender to a performance and comparing baby showers to a drag show. Now, let's start off by addressing the sheer absurdity of this opener. Performing gender as a daily task, I would argue, is a learned cultural trait to which we have all been exposed. The classic leftist move, declare biological reality to be nothing more than a performance, as if male and female are just costumes we put on in the morning rather than immutable facts of nature. But here's the problem. If gender is purely a social construct, why do all societies across every historical and geographical boundary recognize the existence of men and women? Why do biological men and biological women exhibit consistent physiological and psychological differences, regardless of culture? Answer, because gender is not an arbitrary performance. It is rooted in biology, observable in nature, and reinforced through millennia of human experience. But wait, it gets better. The good Reverend then declares, as understandings of drag have changed throughout history, perhaps drag today could be defined as that which threatens the already fragile and arbitrarily constructed framework for gender performance that is necessary to maintain power dynamics. Wow, what a word salad. The translation, drag is revolutionary because it destabilizes gender, which is just a tool of oppression. Let's pause for a moment. This is straight out of postmodernist critical theory, not Christian theology. This isn't about faith, it's about power. Marxist ideology operates on a simple formula. All human interactions are about oppression versus the oppressed. In this case, gender is the great conspiracy, and drag is apparently the noble resistance. But here's the thing. Christianity does not frame life as a perpetual battle between power structures. That's Marxism. The Bible isn't about overthrowing imaginary gender oppressors. It's about salvation, transformation, and aligning our lives with God's truth. If your sermon could just as easily be a gender studies lecture at Berkeley, maybe it's not actually Christianity. Just going to go out on a limb and say that. Then we hit peak insanity. They say, perhaps even before that, when families gather to reveal the sex organs of their child, that the drag show begins. Did you catch that? A baby's gender reveal is a drag show? Let's set aside the unintentional comedy of this claim. What they're actually doing here is gaslighting their audience into believing that acknowledging biological sex is some kind of oppressive ritual. This is how the left manipulates language. They take something universally understood, like the fact that boys and girls exist, and reframe it as sinister, artificial, even dangerous. It's not a drag show when a family celebrates the birth of a child. It's an acknowledgement of reality. The only people forcing drag onto children are the same activists who want to put them in front of half-naked men in public libraries. And here's where we need to have a serious conversation about why this ideology is creeping into churches at all. Christianity is supposed to be about truth, God's truth, not the state's truth, not the university's truth, not the media's truth. When you inject political ideology into worship, it stops being about God and becomes a worship of the state. This is what happens when churches bow to secular progressivism. They become hollowed out social justice clubs with a thin veneer of spirituality slapped on top. The result? A faith that bends over backward to please the world instead of standing firm in Christ. And let's be real, this isn't just misguided, it's demonic. There's no other way around it. Twisting God's creation, attacking his design for men and women, and using the pulpit to preach the gospel of gender confusion is not just wrong, it's spiritual corruption. And let's talk about who benefits from this ideology, because it sure as hell isn't the people in the pews looking for salvation. It's the ruling class. It's the political elites. It's the people who want to strip Christianity of its moral foundation and replace it with a secular creed that demands absolute obedience to ever-changing leftist dogma. When you tell people that their identity is fluid, that their gender is a performance, that truth is relative, what you're really doing is severing them from any solid foundation. People without a firm identity are easier to control. And that's the end game here. Tear down the natural order, blur every line, and replace it with a world where nothing is real except what the state tells you is real. This is why churches that buy into this nonsense die. Because people don't go to church to hear what they could hear from a woke HR department or a corporate diversity seminar. They go to church for truth. They go to be anchored in something eternal. The second you turn the pulpit into an activist soapbox, you replace worship with ideology, and the result is spiritual emptiness. So here's the bottom line. This sermon is not Christianity. It is not faith. It is not truth. It is a political manifesto dressed up in religious language designed to undermine the very foundations of Christian doctrine. It takes gender, something clearly established in Scripture, and warps it into a postmodern fantasy where truth is whatever you feel it is. It takes the celebration of new life and calls it a drag show. And worst of all, it invites people to worship the ideology of the age instead of the eternal God who created them. And to the people sitting in these pews watching this happen, wake up. I'm praying for you. This whole thing isn't about inclusion. This isn't about kindness. It's about redefining truth until nothing happens. And if your church is preaching cultural Marxism instead of Christ, it's time to find a new church. And in other news, Democrats are desperately trying to reach Gen Z, and this is how they're doing it.
Yo, this is the Ranking Rizzler on appropriations, serving Connecticut's 3rd District. It's time to enter your dark academia Congress era. All right, besties, House appropriation is the money moves in Congress. We are not chasing the bag, we are the bag. Democrats are making life smoother through government funding. It's giving, it's giving. So Sigma, main character energy. But Republicans' Project 2025 is mad sus. Eliminating the Department of Education? Negative aura points. Basically, the biggest phantom tax on the environment, on your education, and your rights. Big L posting it online, buddy. Democrats understood the assignment, but go off. See how I keep you informed? Very cutesy, very demure.
What we just witnessed was the most truly painful linguistic equivalent of watching your grandma trying to rap at Thanksgiving dinner. This is Representative Rosa DeLauro, a career politician who's been in office longer than Gen Z has been alive, desperately trying to relate to young voters by butchering their slang like it's a budget proposal she didn't read. Let's go line by line and break down this embarrassing attempt at political pandering. She starts off strong with, "Yo, this is the Ranking Rizzler on appropriations, serving Connecticut's 3rd District." My Adam Sandler came out. You see that? She brought it out. Blame her. Let's stop right there, okay? Ranking Rizzler? Ma'am, the only thing you've been rizzing up for the last 4 decades is the federal debt. And Rizzler, that's a title reserved for people who actually have charisma, not career bureaucrats whose idea of public service is making sure the government spends more of our money. But sure, let's pretend that calling yourself the Rizzler is going to make the national debt suddenly disappear. Also, lady, respect the Rizzler. There is a Rizzler. You're not even a carbon copy of that guy. Then we get, it's time to enter your dark academia Congress era. Now, another obvious TikTok meme, but the irony here is especially delicious because Congress has about as much intellectual depth as a TikTok dance challenge, and invoking dark academia is actually hilarious coming from someone whose party actively wages war on classical education. But hey, if by dark academia she means funneling taxpayer money into useless diversity initiatives while banning books that question the progressive agenda, then sure, Congress is deep in that era. Next up, she says, all right, besties, House appropriations is where the money moves in Congress. First of all, calling your audience besties is a level of cringe that should qualify as a constitutional violation. Second, money moves? That's one way to describe reckless government spending. The federal budget isn't some TikTok side hustle. It's supposed to be a responsible allocation of taxpayer dollars, but Democrats treat it like monopoly money, throwing billions at every pet project imaginable, while inflation eats away at the actual paychecks of working Americans. Now the real kicker. We are not chasing the bag. We are the bag. No, you are the bag. Just not in the way you think. You're the bloated, overstuffed government bag siphoning taxpayer dollars to fund progressive pet projects and failed government programs. Americans aren't securing the bag. They're securing second jobs just to afford groceries. The only people benefiting from this kind of fiscal policy are the bureaucrats handing themselves raises while working Americans foot the bill. Then she really goes off the rails. It's giving what exactly? It's giving unspecific. It's giving meaningless platitudes. It's giving, please make this stop. They should serve this up as torture in Guantanamo. This is what happens when a politician tries so hard to sound young that they forget to actually say anything. Now let's talk about the blatant fear-mongering. She says, Republicans' Project 25 is mad sus, eliminating the Department of Education and negative aura points. Oh no, not negative aura points. Whatever shall we do? Here's a real issue. She's presenting Project 2025 as some kind of nefarious plot, when in reality, the plan to scale back or eliminate the Department of Education is a long overdue response to its utter failure. American education has been on a decades-long decline, with test scores plummeting and schools prioritizing political indoctrination over actual learning. Maybe the federal government doesn't need to micromanage local schools into oblivion. But instead of addressing the reality of our broken education system, she wants to frame Republicans as cartoon villains for daring to suggest that states might do a better job running their own schools. And then we get hit with peak nonsense. Basically, the biggest phantom tax on the environment, on your education and your rights. Ah, yes, the phantom tax, otherwise known as a thing I just co-opted to make whatever I'm saying sounds scary. The actual phantom tax Gen Z should be worried about is inflation, caused by reckless government spending by Biden's administration. But instead of addressing that, DeLauro would rather spin tales about imaginary Republican tax boogeymen, while her own party's policies drive up costs for everything from housing to higher education. And for the big finale, she says, big L for posting it online, buddy. Democrats understood the assignment, but go off. See how I keep you informed? Very cute, oh my God, I can't even finish that. The levels of cringe. I mean, if the goal of the speech was to make everyone physically recoil, then yes, you understood the assignment. But let's be honest, this entire monologue isn't about informing Gen Z, it's about talking at them with a bunch of poorly executed internet slang in the hope that they won't notice that Democrats have been doing nothing to improve their economic future. Wages are stagnant, home ownership is increasingly out of reach, student debt is a disaster, and yet DeLauro thinks yelling Big L in Congress is going to win people over. So here's the bottom line. This isn't leadership, it's desperation. It's what happens when politicians realize they have nothing to offer. So they try to meme their way into the hearts of voters. But Gen Z isn't stupid. They don't need politicians embarrassing themselves with outdated slang. They need actual solutions instead of main character energy. How about economic policies that don't bankrupt future generations? Instead of besties, how about a government that treats citizens like adults instead of social media demographics? Because if this is the future of political communication, then that is the real Big L. Next up, we have Bill Nye, the propaganda guy, who's been running around the country pushing his favorite agenda.
Well, the other thing, everybody, the climate is changing. You can say to yourself it's not, and you can take campaign financing from the fossil fuel industry, and you can pretend the climate's not changing and hurricanes aren't becoming more frequent and flooding isn't more. There's forest fires, wildfires in the Carolinas. That didn't used to be a thing, everybody.
False.
It's because weather patterns have changed and things dried out in an extraordinary fashion that they didn't used to do. You can pretend that's not happening, but it is. And this is where NOAA's service helped us prepare and deal with that. And it certainly informs where to apply whatever limited resources you have to disaster relief. So it's just everybody. The reason you have public service is to serve the public. And by dismantling this public service, you are not serving the public. And I understand where this came from. This engineer who looked for the weakness, found the weakness, exploited the weakness as fast as he unrealistically could, and now we have a system that's broken in many ways that has to be rebuilt. So yeah, this is in nobody's best interest.
Yeah, we need to have a conversation about Bill Nye. Yes, the so-called science guy, except these days it's more like the science fiction guy. Once upon a time, he was an entertaining children's show host. Now he's just another political hack, parroting the same doomsday nonsense we've been hearing for decades. And his latest claim that wildfires never used to happen in places like California before climate change. That's right, folks. Before you started driving SUVs and using plastic straws, the forests of California were just sitting there peacefully, completely fireproof. You buying that? Yeah, neither am I. Now let's start with the obvious. California has always had wildfires. That's not a theory, that's history. The land that is now California has been burning for thousands of years. Indigenous tribes literally use controlled burns as part of their land management practices, knowing full well that dry brush builds up and needs to be cleared out before nature does it for them. And the idea that this is some recent phenomenon caused solely by modern climate change is so blatantly false that even a quick glance at history books, or better yet, a tree ring sample, would expose it. Now let's talk about the rhetorical tricks at play here. Nye starts with this classic straw man fallacy. You can say to yourself it's not changing, and you can take campaign financing from the fossil fuel industry. Ah, yes, the old, if you disagree with me, you must be paid off routine. Because clearly, the only reason someone could be skeptical of exaggerated climate hysteria is if they're cashing checks from big oil. No, not because, say, they actually understand science or history or data. No, disagreement isn't allowed. Either you bow to the climate cult or you're a corrupt shill. Then he hits us with another logical fallacy. Correlation equals causation. There's forest fires in the Carolinas. That didn't used to be a thing. Oh, so wildfires have suddenly appeared where they've never been before, except they have. And once again, history proves it. Lightning strikes, dry conditions, human activity, these have all contributed to fires in the Southeast for centuries. Climate change didn't suddenly create fire. Fire has been around since, well, fire was invented. The idea that wildfires are some brand new phenomenon is as ignorant as saying, hey, we never used to have heat waves in summer before climate change. Remember that? It was cold year round. Yeah, it was called the Ice Age. Don't you miss that? And then my personal favorite, the no true Scotsman fallacy. Nye sets up this idea that only he and his fellow climate alarmists are interested in serving the public. By dismantling this public service in reference to Noah, you are not serving the public. Oh, so anyone who disagrees with the left's bloated, ineffective government solutions must be anti-public service. No room for debate, no discussion of whether policies are effective, efficient, or even necessary. No, just you either agree with us or you hate people. That's the kind of lazy black and white thinking that makes real problem solving impossible. It also doesn't take into account that cutting back on wasteful spending is itself a public service to the taxpayer who's funding all of this. So much so that it is the duty of public servants to ensure that the money is being spent in a smart and effective manner, not just being thrown at the wind the way that propagandists like Bill Nye and Democrats have been advocating for in the last few years. And let's be real, the real reason we have more devastating wildfires today isn't because of climate change. It's because environmental policies have gotten worse. California refuses to clear dead trees. It refuses to do controlled burns. It refuses to allow logging in certain areas. All of that primarily because of draconian environmental laws. So when a fire does start, instead of burning off a little underbrush, it turns into an inferno. That's not climate change, that's just bad governance and policy. And do I even need to bring up the fact that these are the same people who back in the early 2000s told us the ice caps would be gone by 2013? The same people who pushed global cooling back in the 1970s. The same people who have been predicting doomsday scenarios for decades, and yet somehow humanity is still here, thriving, living longer, and adapting like it always has. Now here's the bottom line. Nye's entire argument is built on scare tactics, misrepresentations, and blatant historical ignorance. He wants you to believe that if you just surrender more of your rights, allow the government to expand even further, and pour endless amounts of taxpayer money into climate initiatives, then maybe they'll save you from the big, bad, scary fires. But reality says otherwise. The earth has always had extreme weather. It has always had natural disasters. The difference is, instead of managing the environment responsibly, the left wants to use it as a political weapon to grab more power. And that, my friends, is a real fire we should be worried about. Anyway, yesterday there were 3 protests in California to defend science from Trump's and Elon's Doge cuts. And Bill Nye was one of the speakers at one of these protests, and he's currently going viral on X for doing this very recognizable gesture.
Science! Science!
Oh, wow, folks, here we go again. Bill Nye, the not-so-scientific guy, just did the exact same gesture that had the left foaming at the mouth when Elon Musk did it. And yet, shockingly, I don't see the same media meltdown. Funny how that works, huh? Remember, according to the left's own standard, intent doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's accidental. It doesn't matter if it's out of context. If the hand goes up, it's a Nazi salute. That's the rule they set. But suddenly, when it's Bill Nye, when it's one of their guys, silence. No trending outrage, no corporate think pieces, no unhinged blue sky mobs demanding cancellation. At the end of the day, this isn't just about Bill Nye, Elon Musk, or any one individual. It's about the rules of the game and who gets to break them. It's about a system where hypocrisy isn't an oversight, it's a feature. When the people controlling the narrative can shift the goalposts at will. When they can crucify one person for something they excuse in another. What does that say about the legitimacy of their outrage? If truth is only enforced when it serves their agenda, is it truth at all? The real question isn't whether the double standard exists. It clearly does. The real question is, how much longer are you willing to play along? Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.